Okay. Hello, welcome everyone. Good evening. Thank you for joining this webinar on diabetic gastroparesis. Thanks to Torrent Pharma for doing this important educational initiative despite the trying times that we are trying to cope. We all know that diabetes is growing to be a major health problem affecting almost 1 in 10 of the world population. India is the diabetic capital. And as the number of diabetics and potential diabetes keep increasing, so will be the complications arising from diabetes. And the complications are macrovascular. Diabetes is the leading cause of heart attacks and kidney disease. It is the number one cause of blindness due to retinopathy in a working adult population in the world. And it is a leading cause of non-traumatic amputation of the limbs. By virtue of autonomic neuropathy, it can cause problems with the heart, blood pressure, as well as enteric nervous system that we will focus on today. We all know that the legacy effect or the early metabolic control, especially in the pre-diabetic and the early diabetic stage, has a long-lasting benefit in the terms of cardiovascular mortality as well as in the neuropathy department. However, sustained poor control after diagnosing diabetes can lead to increasing complications. As you can see, the retinopathy can be as high as 25 times risk in a poorly controlled diabetic over a period of several years. So it's very important that early and sustained glycemic control is vital to retard the development of complications. Prevention is much better than cure. So focusing on diabetic autoneuropathy, it can be cardiovascular in the form of partial hypotension, tachycardia. We can have gastrointestinal manifestations. We can have problems with ejaculation and urination, problems with the sweating, and problems with hypoglycemia awareness and unresponsiveness in the form of autonomic neuropathy. Focusing on gastrointestinal neuropathies, we have three major entities, of which gastroparesis is most important because by virtue of its dense nerve supply, stomach may be more sensitive to end autonomic neuropathy target organ damage compared to small bowel and large bowel, as well as the esophagus. So the relationship between diabetes, blood sugar and the gastric function has been noticed for more than a century now, but it was as early as in 1958 the name diabeticorum gastroparesis was given to delayed gastric emptying seen in diabetic patients. So the diabetic gastroparesis is not a very well demarcated entity because it overlaps with more common idiopathic gastroparesis, functional dyspepsia, rumination, cyclical vomiting syndrome, and many other disorders. Therefore, there is no clear consensus, no clear-cut defining characteristic of gastroparesis. But suffice to say that delayed gastric emptying objectively documented in the absence of mechanical obstruction in a patient with insulin-dependent diabetes for 10 years or type 2 diabetes mellitus of a few years duration. This is the working definition for diabetic gastroparesis. Delayed gastric emptying without mechanical obstruction like scarring or mass effect in the pyloric duodenal region or in the proximal small bowel. The epidemiology of diabetic gastroparesis can be quite heterogeneous. It all depends on the population you look at. In the community, it may be that you are 5% of long-standing type 1 diabetics and 1% of type 2 diabetics may be suffering from severe gastroparesis, bad enough to refer for secondary or tertiary care. But if you look at, this is an Indian study of 146 patients, almost 1/3 of gastroparesis patients have diabetes. And conversely, if you look at a large population with diabetes, 3/4 of them will have some form of GI symptoms, of which 1 in 5 will have upper GI symptoms. In general, anywhere from 20 to 50% of diabetic population may be having some upper GI symptoms, pointing towards the possibility of diabetic gastroparesis, which we can confidently say that is under-recognized and not picked up as much as it should be. To understand the delayed gastric emptying in the face of diabetes mellitus, we need to go back to the basics. The stomach has got, we all know, digestive function in the form of acid and pepsin. It has got intrinsic factor in B12 metabolism, but it has got 3 major motility functions. We can call it as a motor function. First, in the fundus proximal stomach, it acts as a reservoir when we take food. That is the reason we continue to eat a sufficient amount of food until we feel the satiety. So the first is accommodation and reservoir. The second one is propulsion in the form of sending the food bolus towards the antrum, which results in mixing and grinding. And the third one is the gastric pump, especially the antrum, which pumps through the relaxed pylorus into the accommodating duodenum. So accommodation and holding, mixing and grinding through propulsion, and emptying the acid chyme periodically into the duodenum are the 3 vital motor functions. And these are influenced by the gastric phase and the cephalic phase through several neurohormonal mechanisms, as well as the local propulsive activity by interstitial cells of the Cajal, which are the pacemakers of the stomach, and the myenteric plexus, which are called Auerbach's plexus, as well as nitrous oxide, VIP, and several other neurohormonal substances, including substance P, etc. In gastroparesis due to diabetes, all the 3 components of the motor function can be disturbed. One, there is impaired fundic accommodation leading to early satiety and fullness. It can be associated with incoordinated propulsion leading to belching, regurgitation, as well as abdominal discomfort. And then poor and delayed emptying lead to stasis, vomiting, nausea, nutritional deficiencies of both macro and micronutrients, significant weight loss, and sometimes electrolyte disturbances. More importantly, unpredictable and erratic emptying can create a complete disturbance of the glycemic profile, because the blood sugar profile in normal as well as in diabetic patients is hugely influenced by orderly emptying and streamlined absorption of the glucose from the proximal intestine. So there are several factors that will go on to affect the gastric emptying. Factors that increase, obviously, the local release of gastrin by mechanoreceptors and stomach distension. Liquids have a special exponential emptying compared to solids, which lag for some time, become viscous, and then they go through much linear emptying from the stomach. Small particles suspended in liquids take the shortcut through the exponential route. Parasympathetic stimulation in the form of vagal activity and acetylcholine are prokinetic and they favor emptying. However, there are counter regulatory factors for gastric emptying. Whenever the acid chyme and the hyperosmolar glucose load enters the duodenum, they can inhibit the gastric emptying by mere distension, hyperosmolarity, low pH, high fat content in the form of free fatty acids in the duodenum, and even protein-rich food in the form of amino acids can have negative feedback. These are also influenced by enteric hormones causing enterogastric reflux. We have secretin, cholecystokinin, substance P, cerebral activity by anxiety and stress, and increased sympathetic activity, again fear and anxiety, psychosomatic overlay. All of these factors go on to delay the gastric emptying. So it is a fine counterbalance between prokinetic and anti-gastric emptying mechanisms. Coming to pathogenesis, we do have several mechanisms linking diabetes to gastric motor dysfunction. We all know that vagal neuropathy occurs along with autonomic neuropathy, as evidenced by fixed RR interval on ECG in any patients with cardiac effect of autonomic neuropathy. There is a local enteric neuropathy, as I said, involving the myenteric plexus, both the excitatory and inhibitory components. There are pacemaker specialized nerve cells called interstitial cells of Kajal, mainly in the proximal stomach, and there is evidence to show that they are decreased in number and activity in diabetic gastroparesis. Blood glucose itself, when it is more than 180 or 200 milligram per deciliter, it can cause acute demyelination of the vagus and cause gastroparesis. This is a vicious cycle. High blood sugar alters gastric emptying, and altered gastric emptying disturbs glucose homeostasis, and patient may enter a very unpredictable vicious cycle of massive hyperglycemia and profound hypoglycemia, all within a span of few hours. There are a special relationship between some of the enteric duodenal hormones and the gastric emptying, mainly glucagon-like peptide, which are called incretins. So when we give incretin analogs or incretin receptor agonists, then we are promoting delayed gastric emptying, which may be already troubling the diabetic patient. So we need to use these agents with a lot of caution in long-standing diabetics with suggestive symptoms of gastroparesis, all the incretin-based medications, as well as alpha glucosidase inhibitors. As I told you, the influence of psychosomatic factors, the fear, the interference with day-to-day life, family life, and work interference can all go and give a negative influence and perpetuate the symptoms. You can imagine a diabetic with unpredictable blood sugar and postprandial vomiting going into psychological distress, and this can only aggravate the symptoms unless it is approached holistically and all the components of the symptom complex are addressed in a empathetic manner. So focusing on pathophysiology itself, when we talk about neuronal changes, it's not only acetylcholine, but the pylorus is relaxed by nitrous oxide, and there may be deficient nitrous oxide with impaired pyloric relaxation. And we already talked about substance P and VIP and other neurotransmitters affecting the relaxation. Both in type 1 diabetic, which is an autoimmune condition, as well as in long-standing diabetic of type 2, we do have evidence of increased oxygen species, decreased heme oxygenase, increased inflammatory cells, macrophages, with a reduction in the number of interstitial cells of Kajal, and contributing to the inflammation and a destroyed neural network within the proximal stomach as well as the antrum. The role of decreased interstitial cells of the Kajal is gaining importance, and that is the reason for introduction of gastric electrical stimulation to supplement the dwindling function of phasic pacemaker activity of the Kajal cells. The glycemia has got a bidirectional relationship, as we will see in later. So the glucose itself has got a very important crosstalk, as we saw. It can both delay and accelerate gastric emptying. The gut hormones, especially the incretin-like hormones, as well as islet hormones, including amylin and insulin, have a direct effect on the gastric emptying. So when the glucose load enters the duodenum, the proximal duodenum secrete GLP, which is glucagon-like peptide, and gastric inhibitory peptide, both increase the insulin output from the beta cells, and GLP is also antagonist for glucagon secretion, and that blunts the postprandial hyperglycemia and trying to achieve euglycemia. Both insulin and amylin are secreted in response to the glucose in the duodenum. Amylin is a gastric emptying inhibitor, and that delays further output of glucose-rich acid chyme into the duodenum. So when we come back to the islet hormones, in fact, supplement of hemin can delay or reverse some of the delayed phasic action potential from reduced number of interstitial cells of the Kajal. That is the evidence that low-grade inflammation due to oxidative stress can be an intrinsic contributor to the development of diabetic gastroparesis. And there is good evidence of reduced neuronal nitrous oxide synthase, which is an important pyloric neurotransmitter. The fourth and the last important mechanism in diabetic gastroparesis is the medicines which we give to treat the diabetes, as well as other intercurrent or contributing factors. The patient might have undergone fundoplication or some kind of gastric procedure which involves interruption of the vagus, as well as non-diabetic medications, many of which will have delay in the gastric emptying, as evidenced by this huge list. Many opioid analgesics, anticholinergic agents, tricyclic antidepressants, calcium blockers, hormone progesterone, octreotide, acid suppressants can have effect on gastric emptying. Whereas there are other medications which may act in favor of gastric emptying, which are prokinetics or promotilin agents, which we'll see at the treatment section. So how do we suspect that somebody has got a diabetic gastroparesis? As I said, in a patient of type 1 of 10 years duration and patients with type 2 of few years duration, when they come with significant GI symptoms, then one should suspect the presence of diabetic gastroparesis and diabetic enteric nervous disturbances. So most important is the nausea and vomiting. Sometimes it's predominantly nausea with very little vomiting, but when vomiting is added on, then nutritional and electrolyte disturbances also set in. Postprandial distress, bloating, belching, early satiety, and sometimes frank abdominal pain can be additional features. Many people have atypical reflex symptoms, regurgitation, etc. What is important at this juncture is, in the beginning itself, eating disorders like anorexia, bulimia in young type 1 diabetics, which may be superadded, cyclical vomiting syndrome, rumination syndrome, all these problems, and in the susceptible population for drug addiction, marijuana addiction, which can cause significant vomiting in the absence of any organic obstruction. All these differential diagnoses need to be entertained before jumping to the clinical diagnosis of diabetic gastroparesis, because the treatment modalities are completely different. So once we suspect the symptoms are due to gastroparesis, then we can apply the gastroparesis cardinal symptom index, which is GCSI, to assess the severity so that we can pick up the treatment strategy, whether it is mild, moderate or severe, so that we can plan and apply rational treatment. Are the symptoms intermittent? Are the symptoms daily but not continuous? Are the symptoms severe enough to affect day-to-day life, work, requiring hospital admissions? Most importantly, malnutrition, electrolyte disturbances, and is the patient pushed into frequent admissions with the diabetic ketoacidosis? All these factors go into assess the severity. GCSI is an important clinical tool to start with. So the 9 cardinal symptoms: nausea, vomiting, inability to finish a meal, anorexia, abdominal distension, retching, stomach fullness, excessive fullness and bloating are assessed as per the severity and score, and patient is stratified as mild, moderate or severe. So untreated long-standing diabetic gastroparesis can lead to several complications, including esophagitis with chronic retching, malady by stare, malnutrition, as I said, vitamin D, macronutrients with significant weight loss. People are prone for acute kidney injury due to dehydration, which is one of the cardinal signs that we need to look for in diabetic patients. Electrolyte disturbance like hypokalemia, metabolic alkalosis. People who continue to eat a high fiber diet can go on to develop a Bezoar formation, and the most worrying and life-threatening is the presence of repeated occurrence of diabetic ketoacidosis and other hyperglycemia-related emergencies like sepsis, infections, etc. The other important aspect of diabetes patients with gastroparesis is the disharmonization or an unpredictable, that is the most important thing, unpredictable relationship between insulin and the gastric emptying. So normally in a patient with a prandial insulin, we can predict that the blood sugar is going to be high 1 to 2 hours after the meal, and therefore taking regular insulin 15 minutes, 20 minutes before the meal is physiological. Here there may be delayed emptying, so much so there is profound hypoglycemia soon after a meal when the insulin is at its peak action but the stomach has not emptied the glucose load, and 2-3 hours later there may be unacceptable hyperglycemia or occasionally there may be unpredictable early gastric emptying leading to dumping syndrome with reactive hypoglycemia, diarrhea, hypotension, sweating, etc. So this day-to-day variation and weekly variation of diabolic relationship between the insulin and the blood sugar and the gastric emptying really makes this diabetes unpredictable, difficult to control, and affects the quality of life very much so in the young type 1 diabetes. So as the definition says, we should have a patient with suggestive symptoms in a diabetic of sufficient duration, and we should document delayed gastric emptying without mechanical obstruction. So the first point is to rule out mechanical obstruction. So invariably all of them will need basic diagnostic OGD, diagnostic upper GI endoscopy, look for a pyloric channel or duodenal ulcer, stenosis, diverticulum or any other extrinsic compression. If in doubt, we can proceed with barium meal follow through or CT with oral contrast, to look for adhesions or atypical or incomplete small bowel obstructions, etc. So that's very important to rule out organic gastric outlet or proximal small bowel obstruction, incomplete or complete, before labeling the patient as diabetic gastroparesis. Also, a baseline ultrasound will look for gallbladder stones or a significant pancreatic disease in CT. These things can mimic many of the gastroparesis symptoms, and the overlap of similar symptoms can make the diagnosis very difficult. So the differential diagnosis and ruling out treatable organic conditions with the structural abnormalities need to be looked for in the beginning itself. Once that is out of the way, then we can go for a positive information to add on to the diagnosis. And even though the gastric emptying is variable day to day, still the professional societies, including Neurogastroenterology and Motility Society and American College of Gastroenterology, call gastric scintigraphy as a gold standard. It is available in big radiology centers in cities. However, it is cumbersome and takes half a day, stopping important medications for 7 to 10 days before the procedure, and requires preparing a radioactive meal. This is physiological because they use a solid meal, because many of the diabetic gastroparesis patients may have normal emptying with liquid meals, but it may be evident only when you use a solid meal as a tracer. So currently the test has been standardized and the report comes like this. If the gastric emptying is delayed, so this is the interested area. This is the normal gastric emptying. You can see only 33% is remaining in the stomach area at the end of 2 hours, and nothing remains in the gastric area after 4 hours. So the standard one is to run the test for 4 hours and then report how much is remaining. And usually if 20% or more is still present at the end of 4 hours, then that is the objective documentation of delay in gastric emptying. We have already ruled out organic obstruction, and this is sufficient to label the patient as having diabetic gastroparesis. But beware, some patients may have gastric delayed emptying with no symptoms, and some patients might have symptoms with the normal gastric emptying, and that is why we need to take the results in the clinical context as well as in the bigger picture of ruling out organic diseases like peptic ulcer or gastric outlet obstruction due to scar or mass. Because the first test, scintigraphy, involves a radioactive material, alternatives have been thought of. Ultrasound can be applied to mark the area of the antrum, baseline as well as after 2 hours and 4 hours. In skilled and trained hands, this can prove a non-invasive method. You can see the relaxed antrum and the contracted antrum. However, we need not say that this investigation is entirely dependent on the operator and can be subjected to variability between operators. More reliable is MRI, but the availability and the expertise to interpret the test is the limitation. When we use gadolinium, MRI imaging can really outline the gastric capacity, the volume, as well as the solid and liquid contents. It can trace the phasic potential propulsion as well as emptying. It is radiation free, but the cost is the prohibiting factor. You can see the antral contraction at baseline, and 3 weeks after motilin agonist erythromycin nicely improving, documented by serial 2-dimensional real-time MRI scans. So the other alternative to scintigraphy, ultrasound and MRI is SPECT, which is single photon emission computed tomography. After 99 technetium pertechnate, which goes into the gastric wall, measurement of regional gastric volume in real time is possible. And the last alternative is isotope gastric emptying breath testing. Here, the 13C is non-radioactive. So when 13C labeled octanoic acid is mixed with a meal, depending upon the gastric emptying, the C13 is metabolized and released in the breath. So the breath samples can be collected and they can be transported to regional centers. So it can be done in any center. This is not radioactive, and with some adequate training, this should be doable in small centers, and this might become an investigation of choice by virtue of both ease of performing as well as non-radiation in future. So there are some special smart wireless capsules called motility capsules. They have been approved for assessing the whole gut transit, including the stomach, small bowel and large bowel. They measure the pH of the milieu, the temperature as well as the pressure throughout the GI tract. So they can last up to 5 days, and we can ask the patient to record significant events like sleep, meal times, etc. to aid the interpretation. This is a recording, so you can see the abrupt change in pH. In stomach, the pH goes down to 2, and sudden change in pH to 4 is due to the expulsion of the motility capsule into the duodenum. And then the small bowel and the large bowel are traced as per the difference in the pressure waves and the temperature. You can see the gastric emptying time in this study is within normal limits of 2.5 hours. So this is another alternative to look at the gastric emptying time in a non-ionizing radiation manner. So having diagnosed diabetic gastroparesis in the right patient with the right symptoms, with the right differential diagnosis ruled out, and one of the tests which has objectively documented gastric emptying, preferably scintigraphy or when available gastric emptying breath test. We need to look at the management, and management mainly focuses on optimizing the glycemic control, on how to reduce the glycemic excursions up and down and improve the quality of life, as well as how to maintain the hydration, nutrition and well-being, and work and life and disease balance, looking at the quality of life of the patient. So when we talk about diet, like I said, one size does not fit all. Fiber diet is usually good, but for somebody with diabetic gastroparesis, high fiber diet may delay gastric emptying and lead to bezoar formation. And again, the fiber should be individualized. Some soluble fibers from oats may be better tolerated than insoluble fibers from wheat. So fiber supplementation should be personalized. The role of a nutritionist who is comfortable and well versed with managing diabetic gastroparesis patients is very, very, very important. I think the nutritionist may be the most important person in managing most of the patients, because I think 70 to 80% of the patients with diabetic gastroparesis are going to have mild symptoms which are going to be managed mostly by dietary modifications and the lifestyle changes. So, as I said, liquids have a special exponential gastric emptying. Therefore, a patient may be advised to drink fluids throughout the meal. Chew well. Now take 30 minutes, 25-30 minutes to finish a meal. When in doubt, blenderize or mix water and make it very puree consistency. When nothing works for a day or two, like I said, it's very unpredictable. One day you may be able to handle soft idlis, and next day even porridge may cause distress and vomiting. So when on a bad day, educate the patient to supplement with only liquid diet and then tide over the bad days like a day or two, and then go back to semi-solids later. The other trick is to have 5 or 6 small meals rather than 2 or 3 conventional large meals. Coffee, alcohol, smoking, stress, sleep deprivation, carbonated drinks, everything that a patient finds offending and precipitating, they should be educated to keep away from them. Whereas the opposite is the mint, ginger, and any other digestive additives they find helpful, they can try and then use judiciously to their advantage. So, as I said, educating the patient, empowering them to understand and modify the diet, as well as not only the content of the diet, the timing of the food, and involving the nutritionist, educating the family members and main carers will go a long way to improve the coping skills and eventually better quality of life for these patients. Repeatedly we have been saying that glycemic control influences the gastric emptying, and gastric emptying influences the glycemic profile. So anything above 200 at given time can acutely affect the gastric emptying, and that is the neurohumoral enterogastric reflux. So if the blood sugar is above 200, for example on the day of scintigraphy, you are going to get a result of delayed gastric emptying. So the aim is to continue to maintain blood sugar below 180 to avoid the acute hyperglycemic demyelination neuropathy related gastroparesis. To that end, the role of you, the physicians, the endocrinologist is very, very important. So once the diabetic gastroparesis becomes quite severe, affecting gastric emptying with nausea, vomiting, unpredictable, I think it's judicious to keep away from significant oral agents like metformin, which can cause GI intolerance, sulfonylurea, which are long-acting and significant risks of hypoglycemia. I already talked about alpha-glucosidase inhibitors, which can aggravate GI symptoms. So, by default, insulin becomes the cornerstone of the therapy. This in conjunction with the primary physician and if necessary input from the specialist endocrinologist should be basal insulin and prandial insulin based regimen, and this should be the mainstay of therapy apart from diet and lifestyle changes. As I said, the prandial insulin can be very unpredictable. A patient may be advised to take 15 units of regular insulin before a decent lunch, but the patient may not finish the lunch they intended to, or they may immediately vomit the lunch, whereas this 15 units insulin is already in the system, running a risk of hypoglycemia. Therefore, it may be a good strategy to use regular insulin after the meal than before the meal, which might be of benefit. And again, the patient needs to try and then see whether this strategy is helping them. So this is a continuous glucose monitoring system for a patient for 1 week period. Each color represents each day. You can see this is hypoglycemia. Now, significant episodes of hypoglycemia, and then you can see several excursions into significant hyperglycemia. This is what is untreated, uncontrolled diabetic gastroparesis, does to the glycemic profile. So apart from using the diabetes technology with modern insulins and lifestyle changes, the professional bodies do recommend use of prokinetics once the patient becomes moderate severity with gastroparesis symptoms. There are two prokinetic agents which are of long-standing familiarity to us. One is metoclopramide and another one is domperidone. Both are dopamine 2 receptor antagonists, and by virtue of CNS activity they are slightly different, but otherwise their efficacy in the GI tract is comparable. So there were even studies of nasal spray with metoclopramide with some moderate benefit. However, acute extrapyramidal reactions as well as a chronic tardive dyskinesia, which is around 1%, does make metoclopramide very unattractive compared to the benefit and risks. Relamorelin is a ghrelin agonist. Ghrelin is the hunger hormone. Like insulin, it promotes gastric emptying, and this is not available for clinical use yet. Whereas domperidone is available in India, even though it is available only on special permission in United States. The doses can be higher than what we normally use. We can use 80 milligram and 120 milligram. But at these doses, they can cause a cardiac side effect like prolonged QT interval. It can also affect prolactin and cause menstrual changes, etc. In some of the patients. So it is not entirely safe, even though it is safer than metoclopramide. So metoclopramide and domperidone are first-line agents used with caution, monitoring side effects. And then we have another alternative called etopride. This is a prokinetic agent with dual action. One is like the previous agents, it does antagonize D2 receptors, but also it interferes with acetylcholine metabolism, thus acting as a cholinergic, which is a physiological antidote for the vagal and enteral neuropathy. So by this dual action, it can act as a prokinetic, but it also has multiple other effects, including antiemetic action and improving esophageal peristalsis. Interestingly, it does not have significant neurological and cardiological side effects, and there are no significant drug-to-drug interactions. So this is the original paper published last year, which shows a clinical benefit in a prospective study. So like I said, apart from delayed gastric emptying, nausea and vomiting are important symptoms in this population. Phenothiazine like prochlorperazine and newer antiemetics, which are 5-HT3 receptor antagonists like ondansetron, granisetron, can be used with a reasonable efficacy to control nausea and vomiting. So we have diet, lifestyle changes, glycemic control with insulin regimen and diabetic technology. We have prokinetic agents, metoclopramide, domperidone, and etopride. We have antiemetics in the form of ondansetron and prochlorperazine. Some analogy to achalasia does exist for diabetic gastroparesis. Here the spasm is in the pylorus and it is postulated as the major mechanism. Therefore, relaxing the pylorus and improving the anteroduodenal coordination emptying is an attractive strategy. But however, the interventions in the form of botulinum injection as well as opening of the pylorus by either stenting or by what we call G-POEM, like the conventional POEM that we do for achalasia. 100 and odd cases have been done for gastroparesis, where endoscopically After mucosal incision, myotomy has been performed in the antropyloric region, but this is still experimental. More data needs to come in, and until then they can be tried only in a tertiary care research or fully audited data collecting setting. Finally, as I said, interstitial cells of Kajal, the pacemakers are reduced, and even if they fire the impulses, we need enough acetylcholine and intact enteric nervous system to propulse and bring it into fruitful gastric emptying. Attempts have been tried with a pacemaker implantation for the gastric motility. Both low frequency and high frequency devices are there. The natural frequency of the stomach is 3 per minute, but the device approved for gastric pacemaker is 12 pulses a minute, and in limited studies it has shown as a boon to some of the refractory symptomatic patients with nausea, vomiting and postprandial fullness, whereas the pain is not much improved in these patients. Surgery is the last resort when there is persistent vomiting and disabling symptoms. Despite the trial of non-surgical options that we have discussed, then a multidisciplinary approach with, in consultation with caring physician, diabetologist, gastroenterologist, nutritionist, and a surgeon interested in diabetic gastroparesis. The selected patients can be tried for symptom relief. This is mainly palliative and to improve the nutrition. For persistent bloating and distress, venting gastrostomy and jejunostomy, and sometimes previous partial gastrectomy or partial vagotomy related operations can be completed with a total gastrectomy or this form of vertical sleeve gastrectomy. So peg is placed in the antral site just above and right of the umbilicus as marked in this pictures. And jejunostomy can be done either surgically or even endoscopically with a percutaneous approach. So surgery is the last resort. So management of diabetic gastroparesis is highly dependent on improving the glycemic control. What are the medications that are going to be harmful, and what are the medications that need to be helpful, as well as assess the comorbidity, and then is there any kind of previous surgical procedures or additional problems that need to be dealt with. So when patients present with upper GI symptoms, we need to identify the cause as possible diabetic gastroparesis in the right patient. To make the positive diagnosis, we need to objectively document delayed gastric emptying by scintigraphy or breath test. But more importantly, we would have already excluded organic obstruction and entertained and ruled out differential diagnosis like rumination syndrome, cyclical vomiting syndrome, functional dyspepsia, etc. The focus is on nutrition and feeding, as well as streamlining the diabetic treatment, removing the drugs which delay the gastric emptying, and improving the glycemic profile using the insulin modifications and glucose monitoring techniques. As an add-on, we have several pharmacological agents and surgery for the refractory patients. So this is the algorithm. I'm sorry, this is not this is a busy slide. So we have lifestyle modifications and nutritionist involvement for mild symptoms. We have prokinetics and botulinum toxin for moderate symptoms. We have pacemaker and surgery for the more severe symptoms. one prokinetic which I forgot to mention is erythromycin. Even though studies are conflicting, I think both IV and oral erythromycin. Erythromycin can be given even 50 to 100 milligram before meals to improve motility function as a bridge between medical therapy and intervention therapy. So in conclusion, it is even though it is uncommon complication, because diabetes is such a common problem, the magnitude is going to be only increasing. At the far end, there are significant symptoms disabling a patient with affecting quality of life, and improving these patients can be a real challenge, and it needs a multidisciplinary, thought through, rational approach. So to diagnose, we need to rule out organic obstruction by endoscopy, barium study, etc., and then do a gastric emptying study by scintigraphy or a breath test when available. After initial diet modification, lifestyle modification, and streamlining insulin therapy, prokinetics, antiemetics, botulinum, and other interventional therapies are available. For the refractory patients, gastric electrical stimulation and carefully thought through palliative surgery are the options. So it's a complex disease which needs our understanding and rational approach. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much. Hi Syed, thank you. So, metformin-induced problems. Yeah. So metformin is number one for type 2 diabetic agents. It's a very rational therapy, as you know, but several patients can develop symptoms after starting metformin. So the temporal profile is important. When somebody's GI symptoms, especially anorexia, postprandial distress, regurgitation and reflux start after metformin, then it is quite important to withdraw metformin, and if it is due to drug induced, you expect the symptoms to resolve within few days, but if it is due to gastroparesis unmasked by metformin, then there may not be much improvement. So that's very important. And metformin can also cause diarrhea, which can be mistaken for diabetic diarrhea. So once a patient has developed symptoms after starting metformin or increasing the dose of metformin, then view metformin with suspicion, withdraw it for a few days, and then see there is temporal resolution. You can go even one step further, reintroduce metformin, and then see whether the symptoms recur. So many patients can be saved from lifelong PPI and a lot of other medications if only the metformin-induced side effect is spotted early and addressed. Hi Damodar. Yeah, the C13 breath test is very attractive because, like I said, some of the breath tests for bacterial overgrowth, for H. pylori, they are becoming more like office-based procedures. The machines are coming at affordable cost, and training your office staff is going to be quite handy. So my vision is this breath test become available soon, and then we can, change the algorithm of workup, because as I said, ACG guidelines want objective documenting of delayed gastric emptying, and I sincerely believe that this test is going to replace scintigraphy, which is more cumbersome, radioactive, costly, and patient needs to travel to a major radiology center. Hello. How long the etoposide can be given? I think when you have a diabetic gastroparesis, I think it's a lifelong condition. My experience is only for limited periods, like 3 to 6 months. And if the patient does have significant benefit, I leave the patients to carry on with it. Sometimes I try acochamide, which is a functional dyspepsia accommodation agent. Again, by virtue of increasing acetylcholine, it has got some similar mechanisms, but interestingly, it increases accommodation, whereas etoposide is more propulsive and pro-kinetic agent. So between these two agents, etoposide and similar prokinetics are preferable. They can be left long term. Compared to levosulpiride and other agents, it does not have effect on CNS, it does not affect prolactin levels, so it is quite safe in selected patients. Hi Karthik. So endoscopic findings, sadly no. I think as you know that when even after overnight fasting, if the patient has got food residue, then you can only interpret in an uncontrolled way that the patient has got delayed emptying. But as far as I am aware, endoscopy, which is an artificial distension of the stomach, cannot talk about peristalsis, and there is no study for correlation with the gastric emptying test. Endoscopy is mainly to rule out organic obstruction. While you are there, you can look for pernicious anemia, H. pylori gastritis, but that's as far it goes. Hi, thank you again. I wish you will all take very good care of yourself, your patients, family, and friends, and then we'll all come out of this tight spot with more grit and more willingness to serve our fellow human beings. Thank you very much for joining. Have a good day. Bye.